Unto Deepest Depths is now out. Thank you all for following along on this game development journey with me, and extra thanks to those of you who picked up the game. As probably the last dedicated post to the game, I want to do a development postmortem today. I will not be discussing marketing or sales strategies because that's not really my focus or expertise, and there's not really anything exciting for me to talk about there anyways. Instead, we'll look at how the game changed over time, the challenges encountered along the way, and the lessons learned from making it. Let's dive in. To start, let's talk about where Unto Deepest Depths came from, as this is not the game I was originally planning as my next Steam release. Instead, I had been working on a business-themed strategy game for about half of early 2024 when I decided that it just wasn't working and that I needed to change directions to something else. Having already spent several months working on something that wasn't panning out, I wanted something simpler and smaller in scope that I could verify quickly. While working on this other game, I had started forming a vague idea of an ultra-minimalist tactics game. Something that gets to the core of the genre while stripping out all of the stuff that would bloat the scope for a solo dev like myself. After a bit of brainstorming and iteration, I settled on an idea all about optimizing unit placement and throwing wrenches into that optimization, resulting in Unto Deepest Depths' unique core rule of all units must move and attack on their turn. This prevents a player from finding the perfect spot and holding up until the enemy waltzes into attack range, makes friendly fire a lot more likely and dangerous, and adds a little bit of a puzzle element to the game while keeping it all straightforward and easy to pick up. I got to work on a proof of concept, and after about a month of working on the idea, I had 25 fixed levels one could play that proved the idea worked. I also had early versions of about half of the units and all 5 biomes that would be in the final game, so I felt confident this was something doable by just myself. So with the new game settled on, I shelved the old game and focused on this one fully. But the game was still not what it would ultimately become, as those test levels weren't just for the proof of concept. The game was originally going to be more puzzle and level oriented, with the primary gameplay experience being to beat pre-designed levels and unit configurations, unlocking the next level upon completion. The only procedural generation was maybe going to be some sort of simple battle generator you could play with as side content, where you could pick your units to play with and battle random units on one of the maps from the fixed levels. So with several levels in place, my focus for a while was on the general game flow and exploring the battle generator a little bit to see if it was viable. But the more I worked on the generator, the more I felt it was where my focus should be. So rather than shifting focuses entirely, I decided I would have a full roguelite mode of some sort with some fixed levels as side content. There are of course no fixed levels in the final game though, as I ultimately decided that they just weren't something that was worth putting time into. It wasn't all a waste though, as the fixed levels made it easy to verify the game design, and the code involved for driving a level-based approach is still used to support the tutorial levels. On the technical side of things, Unto Deepest Depths does of course run on Godot, my go-to engine for many years now. Development started on 4.2, but the final game released on 4.3, even though the engine was actually on 4.5 by the time of release. This is because I am generally hesitant to upgrade engine versions unless a critical bug has been fixed or there's a feature I need in a later version, which is rarely the case. On the other hand, the introduction of new bugs or a change in how a feature works or something like that is much more likely during an upgrade. So I usually only upgrade engines in the first half or so of the development cycle when the impact of a breaking change is relatively low and likely to be caught, and then I stay locked to that version for the rest of development. Hence the jump from 4.2 to 4.3 and no more. The Switch version though is running on 4.5, as my publisher was in charge of that port and wanted to update the engine. For the most part, this just worked, but being on separate versions of Godot did lead to a bug in the game, as how resource duplication works changed in 4.5. As pretty much all unit and player data are custom resources that make heavy use of duplication to function, this did lead to a game-breaking bug on Switch before release. Thankfully though, we did catch it in time and patched it before release, and even before any of the pre-release reviewers caught it, so everything worked out okay. Speaking of the Switch version, it does, as you would expect, have full controller support, and this is the first game I've made that supports controllers. I have played around with it a bit in the past, and I think there's a game jam or two out there that has some light controller support, but it was a whole other deal to make sure the game is fully playable with a controller. Technically, supporting controllers is pretty simple with Godot since you can just map their inputs the same as any other, but practically speaking, you're looking at spending plenty of time configuring focus neighbors and testing for edge cases. It got there eventually, but it did take some time and I did have to shift how I think about UI a bit to support controllers. To help with controller support, I used the Controller Icons plugin, which lets you make input prompts that dynamically change depending on what input method the player is using. This was very helpful to have, and it saved me a lot of time so I wouldn't have to implement the same thing myself. Check it out if you want an easy-to-use system for dynamic input prompts. On the design side of things, once I had settled on the roguelite approach, the core gameplay didn't change significantly from conception to release, but that doesn't mean it was all smooth sailing. One of the things I had settled on early in development was that I wanted to keep numbers small and any upgrades or stat impacts significant. For instance, most unupgraded units have between 1 and 4 points of health, and most units do 1 or 2 points of damage. So each time a unit is hit is impactful to the state of battle, and upgrading a unit to have even just an extra point of health can be the deciding factor between surviving another turn or not in future battles. Likewise, you can pump up the damage on your own units and dispatch foes quickly before they have time to wear you down, but doing so may require taking more of a glass cannon approach for a while, where you'll be running closer to a 1 or 2 hit death. I find this approach satisfying to play, but it was difficult to balance. As XP is the only currency in the game, and it drives almost all promotion and upgrade choices, it had to be dialed in just right to make this approach of small numbers with meaningful impacts work, and the early feedback on the game's demo was unanimous that I did not have it right. XP rewards were too low, upgrade costs were too high, and I didn't have enough room for the nuance needed to get things dialed in, as a single XP increase or decrease in cost could completely shift the viability of an upgrade. So I ended up having to rework the XP system entirely. I doubled all XP values in the game and rebalanced from there, which let me get the nuance that the first attempt was missing. So while getting XP sorted out for units was challenging, a part of the XP system I've had from the beginning that I think works well is the automated power scaling of battles based on the player's progress. With the exception of boss battles, which are fixed instances I designed by hand, every battle in the game is generated via a point-buy system, which works like this. Every enemy unit has a cost associated with it based on its difficulty to all other units. Each world defines a pool of units it can draw from and their odds of being drawn. Every time the player gains XP in the game, a value tracking their cumulative XP gain is updated. When a battle is being generated, this cumulative XP is fed into a function that returns a budget to be used to buy units for that battle. The battle generator then draws from the valid unit pool until it has spent its budget, places the enemies around the map, and that's that. From the beginning of the roguelite mode, this was my planned approach to procedurally generating battles, and I think it works pretty well. It certainly required a lot of testing and adjusting, but being able to say something like, players think this section with a budget of 20 is too easy, and this later section with a budget of 40 is too hard, gave me an objective way to look at the game's difficulty and make adjustments. Of course, getting the cost of the enemies right was its own challenge, as was the modifiers that can be applied to the difficulty, such as the depth levels or player backgrounds, but in the end I didn't find it a terrible way to get the balance dialed in. Something I'm more mixed on is the approach to map design. All of the maps in Unto Deepest Depths were hand-designed, with the battle generator simply picking one from the pool of options, and on some maps randomly placing objects around it for variance. The benefit of this approach is that each map was designed with specific consideration, but the downside is that making all those map variations was a lot of work, and after a few runs through a given world, the player may start to notice repeated map layouts. I debated this approach a fair bit and did explore doing more procedurally generated content, but I just could never shake the concern that the generator would mess something up, and in a game with punishing difficulty, losing to the generator would be really unfair. Of course, this is a solvable issue, and if I ever do a sequel to Unto Deepest Depths, which I do have plenty of ideas for, I will probably spend more time exploring procedural options and seeing if there's a way to keep variety up while getting it constrained just how I want it to be. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk timeline, specifically as it relates to playtesting and feedback. Unto Deepest Depths began development in June 2024, had a minimal prototype ready in July, and development shifted fully towards the roguelite approach around August. The game was announced in early September, and the first public demo was released on Steam later that month. The early days of development were a bit condensed as I wanted to have the game announced, and the demo released in time for Steam's turn-based RPG Fest. To hit the festival deadline, I had to work hard to have the game in a state that was playable and polished enough to be releasable as a demo. Ultimately though, I think I released it a bit too early. The balance was brutal, the visuals were a bit lackluster, and there were rough edges I already knew needed a fair bit of work. Feedback, which came from a combination of social media, Discord, and a Google form link embedded in the demo itself, was still generally positive, but it was clear that there was a lot of work to be done, which I already knew, but I do worry that the first impression was not as strong as it could have been. I suspect that spending even just another month or so on the game before releasing the demo would have allowed me to really get it into a good place and make that stronger first impression. Despite this though, I did get a lot of great feedback on the game, especially as it related to game balance. The demo lets you play through the first of 5 worlds in the game, so player feedback from the demo was a good representation of what their expectations were for the final game and where improvements could be had. One of the simpler design lessons learned from the demo, which ended up becoming a foundational shift in how I balanced the game, was that people absolutely did not like completing the first battle on the map and then not being able to spend that XP on anything. Feedback was unanimous that players should have the option to use their XP right away on something. Whereas I had previously been looking at XP as it related to upgrades at the world and overall game level, I started to shift my view to looking at it in terms of battles as well. This upgrade takes 2 battles to earn, this one 3, etc. When I started doing that, it kind of all just started to feel right and like the balance was coming together. For instance, I made the cost of the Helping Hand upgrade tied to the XP earned in battle. That way you have something to get right away if desired, and then planned the rest of the upgrades so that you were never more than 1 battle away from something on the upgrade tree. This new balance meant that there was a constant flow of potential upgrades the player could get, and if they had their eye on something, they had a clear path on how to get it, where every battle felt like a meaningful contribution towards that goal. I continued to collect demo feedback through most of the development cycle before removing the link to the Google form a few months before release, when I felt that there really wasn't much more benefit to hearing what people thought about just the initial part of the game, and instead shifted my focus to playtesting the full game. My partner and I did a significant amount of early playtesting, and then I gave the game to a few friends to get their feedback. This let me catch some of the obvious issues with the game, such as major balance problems, bugs, things like that, and then it was time to hand it over to external playtesters who volunteered from my Discord. This Discord playtest was really where the game came into its own. I thought the game was pretty close to ready to release when I started playtesting and just needed a few minor tweaks and polish here and there. But the playtesters showed me just how much there was still to do on the project. So the month or so where the bulk of the playtesting occurred ended up being possibly the busiest time of the development cycle, as I tried to quickly address feedback so as not to waste the playtesters' time on a bad build, get as much feedback as I could on new builds, and to help keep the release to sometime in 2025. It was during this time that a lot of the best additions to the game occurred, usually as a direct result of feedback or suggestions by the playtesters. I overhauled or replaced several events in the game to make things more balanced and interesting, added the ability to place your units manually before battle, both increasing the strategic element of the game while also fixing annoyances with poor random unit placement, added icons to units during battle to help convey more information about what they had going on, added additional UI for the potential attacks of blocked units, fixed plenty of UI jank, and much more. This really was the time when the game came into its final form, so let me just take a moment to give a big thanks to everyone who playtested the game and shared such very detailed feedback. You really were a critical part of the game's development. And that's a look at how development on Unto Deepest Depths progressed and some of the challenges encountered and the ways the game changed over time. I'm proud of what I've made, and I feel I grew a lot as a game developer from making this game. So once again, thank you to everyone who has followed along from the game's early days, and I look forward to sharing the next game with you as well.